Good evening. My name is John Dickinson, and I am a student project manager at the Clarke Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clarke Forum, the House Divided Project, the Departments of History and American Studies, and the Program in Policy Studies, I would like to welcome you to tonight's Winfield C. Constitution Day event, The Fugitive Slave Law and the Crisis Over Immigration Policy, Assessing a Forgotten Legacy. In preparing for tonight's lecture, I spent a preponderance of time researching the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The act, passed by the U.S. Congress as a part of the Compromise of 1850, mandated the capture and return of escaped enslaved individuals and called for the full assistance of the federal government in recapturing efforts, as well as fines and jail time for those who assisted runaways. However, many Black communities, abolitionists and alliance networks, and slaveholding communities defied the law's implementation. One individual who stood out to me was John Brown, a radical abolitionist who helped to establish an anti-slavery guerrilla group called the League of Gileadites. In a sense, we can see the collective effort of all the individuals who resisted the ordinances of the Fugitive Slave Act, including the League of Gileadites, as forming de facto sanctuary jurisdictions. The lessons learned from the fallout of the Fugitive Slave Act serve as precedent for the current immigration policies of the United States that bear bitter fruit. On June 9th, I read a news article from the Washington Post about a 39-year-old Honduran man named Marco Antonio Munoz. Even as I recount this, my heart still aches. He was a father to 2 sons, a husband to Orlando de Munoz, and a coffee farmer, among many things. Munoz and his family crossed the Rio Grande in Texas to seek asylum following the murder of his brother-in-law in Honduras. Their request was not granted. Instead, Munoz was forcibly separated from his 3-year-old son and his wife and taken to an isolation cell at Starr County Jail, 40 miles away. On May 13th, Munoz was found dead in his cell of an apparent suicide, with the only account of his death given by guards. Unfortunately, this trauma is not new and is in fact woven in the fabric of this nation, from the family separations of the antebellum period onward to those of off-reservation boarding schools for indigenous peoples. My parents are immigrants and know firsthand the pain of leaving family behind, in a journey of displacement that poses risks to both the body and psyche. To be told that you do not have the right to exist on stolen land is in fact dissonance. Indeed, the land which we stand on today here in Carlisle was originally inhabited by the Susquehannock, Delaware, and the Lenape peoples. To be denied the right to keep family is dissonance, yet it is history and it is present. These ruminations have made me very pleased to be introducing tonight's panelists, who will be discussing the early controversies and debates sparked by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and how they may offer insight into contemporary debates over the immigration policies of the Trump administration. Richard Blackett is Andrew Jackson Professor of History at Vanderbilt University. From 2013 to 14, he was Harmsworth Professor of American History at Oxford University. Blackett has also served as associate editor and acting editor of the Journal of American History and editor of the Indiana Magazine of History. He is also past president of the Association of Caribbean Historians. Andrew Delbanco is Alexander Hamilton Professor of American Studies at Columbia University, president of the Teagle Foundation, and an elected member of the American Philosophical Society. In 2012, he was awarded a National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama. Judith Giesberg is Professor of History at Villanova University and editor of the Journal of the Civil War Era. Giesberg is conducting a digital project. Currently, Giesberg is conducting a digital project, Last Seen, Finding Family After Slavery, a tool for telling family stories of separation and survival during slavery, emancipation, and the Civil War. Our moderator for tonight's event, Matthew Pinsker, is Professor of History and holds the Brian Polhanka Chair of Civil War History at Dickinson College. Pinsker also serves as director of the House Divided Project and has held fellowships at the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College, the National Constitution Center, and the New America Foundation. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. There will also be a book sale and signing in the lobby following the program. The Clarke Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please know that handicapped accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now, please join me in welcoming tonight's panelists.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to Dickinson. We really appreciate this. And of course, we're all looking forward to this discussion. You know, it's got historical context and it's relevant to current events. It's Constitution Day, so we're going to be talking about the Constitution. But I always like to start these kind of discussions with a note of modesty. I worry in a history classroom that people who try to use history to support a view in the present day that they can abuse history. And so I wanted to see, before we get started on the actual topic, how the three of you approach that question. So many people do a bad job using history to give insight and offer lessons into the present. How can we trust that you won't do that? And what do you plan to do to give us some nuance and some perspective?
I plan not to do it.
Yeah. So I actually wanted to start with Judy on this
Excuse
one.
me, what's the it?
The it is abuse history.
We're not to abuse it.
Judy, in some ways, your op-ed several months ago about sanctuary cities kind of inspired me to think about this. So I wanted to know what you did in that op-ed to try to create a sense of balance and use history, you know, in a sophisticated way, not in a simplistic way.
So the op-ed was actually a response to Jeff Sessions' I thought misuse of history when he referred to sanctuary cities as at the center of a new secessionist movement. So his paralleling cities like Philadelphia, and he was speaking in Philadelphia when he made that comment. Actually, he was at the Union League when he made that comment. In fact, ironically, and he mentioned that he talked about sort of that local resistance to ICE was really a parallel movement to the secessionist movement. And I was speaking the next day at the Free Library of Philadelphia about the Fugitive Slave Law. And so I decided I was just going to talk about what Jeff Sessions said and sort of unpack it and think about, really the sort of nature of federalism and what that means and what he was really intending when he made that comparison to, he sort of drew a straight line from resistance to, resistance to the immigration policies of the Trump administration to secessionists. And it was just too easy. It was too easy of a thing for me not to respond to it. But I was also really careful about pointing out, what that local resistance was about, who was in charge, who was behind that local resistance, and what their intentions were, and really how those kinds of federal policies, like the policies that of compelling these local communities to cooperate with ICE, how they could backfire. I'm always really careful with my students about, when they say those kinds of things, like it's just history repeating itself, because it doesn't really repeat itself. By the same token, I do think it's important for people who look at the sources like we all do and like your students do, to step in when somebody makes a gaffe like I thought had been made in that particular case.
Right. I mean, Andy, how do you approach this kind of subject?
Well, I think, first of all, I should say, you might not have been able to tell that from the kind introduction, but I'm sort of the one person sitting up here who's not a professional historian. That is, my field, such as it is literary studies. I found myself getting interested in some particular issues in American history, including the ones we're talking about tonight. And as I tried to educate myself about how to think like an historian, the point that continually forced itself upon me, and it's sort of hard to remember when we read books about the past, is that no one knew what was going to happen. Just as we'd have no idea what's going to happen, right? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the short term with the battle over the confirmation of a candidate for the Supreme Court. We don't know whether we're living through an era that's going to lead to a very severe reactionary regime in the future, or whether maybe we're going to enter into a new era of progressive politics in 10 or 15 years from now. We have no idea what's going to happen. And what that means to me when I think about the past or the issues we're here to talk about tonight is that it's very hard to know how to act in critical situations, and it's hard to anticipate what the consequences of one's actions are going to be. So I guess what I would say, not to go on and on about it, is that as I study the past, I think it helps to inculcate a certain feeling of humility. That is, that the past was complicated, just as the present is. And rather than sit in judgment on who did the right thing and who did the wrong thing, I try to understand how people of goodwill were wrestling with difficult problems, just as we do today. That's the best I can do with that question. Okay.
And Richard, you've already vowed not to abuse history. All right, but is there anything you want to add to what Judy and Andy said?
As a foreigner, and I suppose you could pick that up from my accent, as a foreigner, I teach in American history. I ask my students, America is very proud of saying, and saying it over and over again, that they are a society of laws. That sounds a wonderful idea, but what happens if the law is terrible? Right. What happens if the law is morally indefensible? What does the citizen do in a context like that? Because the only resolution you have, if you follow this argument to its logical conclusion, is that you have to sit until the law is changed. Now, we know America has passed horrendous laws in its history, and we're going to talk about one of them in a minute. But how do you resolve that dilemma? And it seems to me, as we look at these laws and how people like modern attorney generals are using laws, what happens if good people defy a bad law? What do we do when bad people defy a good law? And in American history, there's a lot of good laws that bad people have defied. And I think we are beginning to see it again in one of those cycles of reaction to America inching its way towards its principles. We are in a period of retreat, I would argue, nowadays, and it's a period where good laws are being violated by bad people. And that concerns me. And I think that's how I approach discussing things like the Fugitive Slave Law.
Right.
Because that is a bad law. It's a morally indefensible law.
Could be the worst law in American history.
I could think, and yes.
So the focal point of our comparison tonight will be from the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. There were two fugitive slave laws at the federal level. One was from 1793. We'll mention it briefly. But they all derive back to the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, which was part of the original document that was framed on this date in 1787. John Dickinson, our namesake, was a founder who was involved in the framing of the Constitution. He supported it, even though he opposed slavery and was worried about those trade-offs. I wanted to see how the three of you approach the question of those trade-offs at the founding, especially when you talk about the Fugitive Slave Clause. I mean, what is the most important thing people should know about that clause? Or what are some of the most important things people should know about that clause and the trade-offs the founders made at the origins of the country?
But one thing is that those two words are not used in the Constitution.
Yeah. Now, why do you think that's important, that the word slavery is missing?
They found different ways of of coming up with the word.
Because they were ashamed?
I don't know if they were. I have never seen any document that says, I'm sitting here debating the Constitution and I am really ashamed about what we are doing. No, I think they devise ways to get around. I mean, listen, if you declare from the tops of rooftops or from the mountaintop or wherever you're declaring that we believe in a foundational idea that all men are created equal, and at the same time you're creating a system, the basis of which is inequality, you are forced to confront that reality. And I think that's one of the mechanisms they devised to get around this conundrum that they created. Because there's no other, I don't think there's any other revolutionary principle ever been articulated. All men are created equal. That is an amazing, I don't even think the Haitian revolutionaries said that. But so you have expressed that idea, and then you turn around, and at the same time, you're building a system based on slavery. You have to you have to deal with that.
I think when you go back and read what the founders wrote both privately and publicly, you get the feeling that some of them at least understood that they were caught in this contradiction. So James Madison, who was pretty close to the guy who wrote those words about all men being created equal, does say, he says it much later on, that we did not want to install in the Constitution the concept that there could be property in men. So they didn't, as Professor Blackett says, they didn't allow the word slavery in the Constitution. One of the great ironies of American history is that that word doesn't enter the Constitution until the 13th Amendment, which is passed in order to eradicate the institution of slavery. But it was in there nevertheless. There were various provisions of the Constitution that were there explicitly to protect it, including the Fugitive Slave Clause that we're here to talk about tonight. So how does one explain how it got in there? And the answer, I said earlier, I'm interested in the complications. There were some delegates to the Constitutional Convention, like Mr. Pinckney from South Carolina and Pierce Butler from South Carolina, who were very enthusiastic about it and thought, it had to be there, and went back to their home legislatures and says, listen, we've built in some really good protections so that our slave property won't be able to escape to the free states. But there were others who were very queasy about it and looked the other way and probably had to search their conscience over this question, the question of what do you do when you're signing on to a bad law. One way to explain that is because there's something good that they thought would come out of it, namely the creation of a nation that was already clearly going to be half free and half slave. If you were going to put that nation together, it was very hard to see how that could be done without building in some protections for the interests of the slaveholders. It could have gone in a different direction and said, we're not going to do this. But it's not clear to me that you could have put that nation together without that in there. By letting it in there, they created a problem that would take almost 100 years to confront.
Right. So just to clarify, what Andy just said, the clause says no person held to service or labor in one state escaping to another state can be discharged. They have to be delivered up. And so...
But every person every state that signed on to this Constitution was a slaveholding state.
Right. So
Well,
yeah.
that's
So
true.
that, that sort of.
So,
I was thinking.
guys were saying, listen, if my slave run away to your slave state, would you send him back to me? Yes. So they are protecting their self-interest.
But every state in the North was beginning to move toward freedom. Pennsylvania
but-
being at the
Right,
forefront.
they would-
But remember what Andy says, we couldn't tell that in 1784.
I think we could
Although-
tell.
In Pennsylvania, we could.
Well, in Pennsylvania,
Though,
okay.
W.E.B. Du Bois, arguably the greatest African-American intellectual of the 20th century, in his book on the suppression of the slave trade, says that he really believed that by putting in an end date to the slave trade, which is one of the provisions in the Constitution.
Actually, it said you couldn't end it until
Correct.
that preserving it until at least 1807.
Correct.
See,
But the
historians can
expectation
focus
was-
on literary studies too. Right?
But the expectation was that the slave trade would not be tolerated after 20 years. And Du Bois says, I don't know if he's right or not, but he says that he believes that most, if not all, of the delegates to the convention believed that that was the beginning of the end of slavery. So there's an argument to be made that most of the founders thought, okay, we'll allow this obscenity to be there because we don't think it will last very long. Now, they turned out, as we know, looking back from the future, they were dead wrong about that. And slavery became more integral to the United States with every passing decade.
Right.
But I'm not sure that that's what they expected.
So,
I think
go ahead, Judy.
I would just add one thing into our consideration of that last thing that you said was that the United States, and because of South Carolina and Georgia, actually imports more slaves between, right, the signing of the Constitution and the closing of the trade in 1808
Yes.
than they do, in decades before. So it's actually, when the Constitution's signed, right, there's a huge spike.
Right.
And America sort of rushes into the Atlantic slave trade with gusto. So I guess,
Correct.
Maybe, maybe some of the delegates were thinking in those terms, but I be hard pressed to see those states like, again, South Carolina and Georgia that just imports, tens of thousands of slaves in those, in just the last 2 decades before the closing of the trade in 1808.
Right.
No, that's certainly true.
But no matter what the framework was in 1787, it became clear over the subsequent decades that the country was dividing along sectional lines, and the North was becoming free, and the South was becoming entrenched in slavery, not giving it up. And so the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 upset a lot of people on both sides. It wasn't working. And then we're building toward pressure that's going to lead to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the one that we think has the greatest parallels to this crisis over immigration that we're living through right now. Now, of course, it was part of the Compromise of 1850, but I wanted to see if the three of you wanted to give people in the audience a little more context about that pressure in the 1840s that was building toward the push, especially from the South, for a tougher law. What was it about the 1840s that made the coming of a new fugitive slave code seem so essential to the slaveholders?
You want me to take it on?
Can you start? Describe the resistance of the 1840s.
Well, one thing you have to realize is that there had been increasing demands for a more stringent fugitive slave law well into the 19th century. By the time we get to the 1820s, it is being bandied about that this needs to be done because the present fugitive slave law doesn't have the sort of teeth that it needs in order to be operative. But it is conditions that are taking place in the 1840s that really make this possible. One of them is a clearly demonstrable increase in the number of slaves who are running away. That is one thing that is happening. And there are some pretty dramatic slave escapes. Box Brown would be one. Yeah?
This is Henry Box Brown in 1849.
William and Ellen Craft from Georgia. I mean, it demonstrates a certain ingenuity on the part of the enslaved as well as their supporters to get out of slavery. And this is causing increasing problems around. And the third factor I think I would put there that provides the political background to make this possible is the acquisition of new lands at the end of the Mexican-American War.
Right.
So you have a vast territory that America has acquired from the defeated Mexicans, and the question is, what do you do with this? And where does slavery go? Can slavery go into these new areas? And it becomes, in terms of the trade-off that is going on in Congress, one of the clauses of the compromise becomes this more stringent fugitive slave law. And it is an enormously stringent law with all sorts of teeth. It's a law that federalizes slavery. Right. And I think that is what becomes absolutely critical. Now, everywhere you go, all you folks in this audience, in free Pennsylvania, become, in fact, agents for the recapture of fugitive slaves. If an authority, a sheriff, a local, says, you need to help me capture fugitives, you are compelled by this law to do it on the penalty of an enormous fine.
Right, you're describing the effects of the 1850 law.
Yeah, it becomes really, it nationalizes the recapture of slaves.
Right. Judy, do you want to add to that? Is there a comparison there to the immigration issue that you see as the pressure builds over fugitive slaves? Is it the refugee crisis of their era?
Well, I guess I was also just thinking about one other part of the building pressure to have this stronger law was the state laws that were being passed that were protecting fugitives. So there were personal liberty laws. Pennsylvania passed a personal liberty law. Other states passed personal liberty laws in which they said that they would not cooperate with the rendition of slaves. So there was already local resistance, already growing. that then, put the pressure on Congress to pass this stronger and more stringent law. And I think that the same could be said about what's happening today. I mean, we have a new name for kind of, we sort of call these sanctuary cities now, but there's a longer history of Americans not, obeying all the immigration laws of this country, and teachers who have students who come forward and identify as undocumented, and healthcare workers. I mean, there are all levels of this society in which people have always helped undocumented immigrants, and so there are certainly sort of local precedents, to suddenly face this situation where really the ante has been upped, and at least rhetorically, the administration has threatened to cut funding from cities that fail to cooperate. All of that stuff could potentially backfire, I guess, is another parallel that I think has
I mean, that was
happened.
the heart of your op-ed about the secessionists being the federal government in this case, not the sanctuary city advocates who you compared to the abolitionists, right? You
Right.
see them as a federal resistance. It's kind of what Richard was saying before when he said sometimes bad people tackle good laws. You were comparing the personal liberty laws to being the good force
Right.
in this equation.
Right.
Can you just describe those personal liberty laws a little bit more? I mean, how would you convey the depth of that federal issue to somebody who's not an expert in the period?
Yeah. So I think, as Richard was saying, right, there were states that had, by 1850, had for decades had been free states, had defined themselves as free states, had abolished slavery. Yet, as long as there were these fugitive slave laws in existence, you could be, and even before the stronger 1850 law was passed, you could be called upon to participate in the institution of slavery. So these were, these personal liberty laws were passed in response to, local people locally who didn't feel that they should be, coerced to participate in an institution that they thought was morally reprehensible, and that went against their own state laws. So these personal liberty laws stated that, they varied from state to state, but they could say things like you cannot force local officials to help with the rendition of slaves, other sorts of protections like that.
But those personal liberty laws are really significant because they go back to the Attorney General observation that federal law trumps state law. Right? Because there's a Supreme Court ruling in 1842 that says, look, states have to adhere to federal law, but they don't have to actively help them to do it. So what states like Pennsylvania did was pass liberty laws, personal liberty laws, that said, for instance, you can't use state prisons to hold slaves who are being sent back. Now, in a period when there are no federal prisons, where do you hold the person at a time when the local community is up in arms against it?
Well, you have it right here in Carlisle, an example to your point, right, where a Dickinson College professor goes to the local courthouse where a couple of slave...
I'm sorry, could you just say that louder?
Yeah, a Dickinson College professor
right.
goes to the
A
local
very
courthouse
brave
and gives an education
defiant
lesson to the
Dickinson College professor.
local judge, to the effect that you've got a couple slave catchers who've shown up in town and they brought their captives to the courthouse and where they're being held. And correct me if I've got the details wrong. And the Professor McClintock, right?
John McClintock, the greatest professor before some of the professors in this room.
Goes to the court and says, listen, by the way, the news might not have reached you yet, Judge, but the Pennsylvania legislature passed a law a little while ago, modeled on a Massachusetts law, that says just what Richard just said. You cannot use state facilities to incarcerate captured fugitives. And they said, okay, we'll give them into the hands of the slave catchers, and then a riot ensued. So there was a real case in point where human beings, black and white, academic and otherwise, got caught up in this drama. So we're not talking about an academic subject here.
Right. This is
And
in
there were a lot
Carlisle
of
in
those,
1847. It's at the center. Pennsylvania's on the front lines of all of this. The Supreme Court case that Richard mentioned was Prigg versus Pennsylvania. But the question, I guess, for us now is, are there lessons to be learned from that battle for the modern day, for this battle between the Trump administration and states that are trying to protect their values?
If I could say something slightly contrarian, because that's what I do for a living.
Good.
Right. I mean, I think this is an important conversation, and I'm very delighted to be on this panel. But I think we want to, before we get maybe even to the parallels, of which there are, I think, some important ones, we want to think about some of the differences, too.
Okay.
We have something like 11 million last time, but it could be a different number, undocumented immigrants in the United States now. The numbers of fugitive slaves, and I don't know that historians agree completely on what those numbers were, but compared to the several million enslaved human beings in the United States, it was a very small number. So my sense is that the fugitive slave problem was, and I don't mean by this statement to in any way minimize the human tragedy that fugitives experienced when they ran with or from their families, but that the fugitive slave problem was largely a symbolic problem. It was largely a question of, would the northern states respect what southern slave owners construed to be, correctly or not, their constitutional rights? That's a different situation than we have now. It was also a problem around internal borders, state borders within a nation that claimed to be one nation. We have a problem of how to police our borders with other nations. To what extent can we arrive at some kind of rational immigration policy, and what are the rights as human beings of those who have braved all the consequences of coming illegally into this country? Those are two very different situations, I think.
Well, look, I know you're emphasizing differences, but I'm a Lincoln scholar, so I can't resist this.
Right.
In 1859, Lincoln is giving a speech in Ohio, and he speaks to Kentuckians and Southerners, and he says, you know, what are you going to do, build a wall to separate us? What are you going to do, build a wall? How stupid is that, he seems to be saying.
Yeah, and I think and it's not, those kinds of big events like you described that happened here in Carlisle happening all along the border. It's really quite astonishing to see in newspapers people talking about going to fist fights in Philadelphia. There's they're happening in New York. It's all over the place. So it's quite, in the days before the stuff could be tweeted out and through social media, this stuff is happening all over the place, and it's being covered in the newspapers, and people really are galvanized by this, by seeing, Anthony Burns march through the streets of Boston, and really getting to feel like this is really quite, that what we're experiencing here is the inability of states to define, to pass their own laws. States of the North can't pass a law to abolish slavery. As long as we have a fugitive slave law in place, we cannot protect Massachusetts, we can't protect Pennsylvania from slavery. So they did feel as if, or certainly that's the way they're responding in the papers, they felt like this was a threat to their states' rights.
So
and they did articulate it that way.
Are you rejecting that word symbolic that Andy used? I mean, do you think it's something else?
They certainly felt like it was not, they're articulating something that they're not seeing as symbolic at all. And they're really using states' rights language to do so. Right.
The irony of all of this is everybody associates states' rights with the South, but you're describing northern states' rights.
Oh yeah, that's exactly the language that they use. This is our right as a state to define right.
But interestingly, if you look at the congressional debate over the Fugitive Slave Law, Jefferson Davis, of all people, opposes the Fugitive Slave Law because he says it's an interference. One of the reasons it's an interference in state right. So I have never said anything positive about Jefferson Davis in my life, but here it is. So he is opposed to it, and he's opposed to it also on the ground that you cannot have an effective law if it is not supported by the community which it governs. So he keeps asking his colleagues, how are you going to do this?
And on that point, he agreed. Lincoln said the same thing about the Fugitive Slave Law.
That's the only thing the two of them agreed on. Yeah.
Right. And in fact, Jefferson Davis turned out to be prophetic about this, right? Because the federal government invoked, after the Civil War, invoked the Fugitive Slave Law as a precedent for imposing laws on the defeated South, providing civil rights to black people. So this whole thing about states' rights and federal power is very complicated, as we've said. We, in our own time, going back to the Jim Crow era, we think of states' rights as belonging to the racists and belonging to the reactionaries. But in fact, in the middle of the 19th century, it was the New Englanders who invoked states' rights and said, get your federal troops out of my city. You know, this is my city. I don't want you here invading the rights of our citizens. So it's a tricky business.
So what we could conclude is that they are good state rights and bad.
Right, we could, and you and I would, I think, more than likely agree on what the good laws and the bad laws are and what the good rights and the bad. The problem, of course, is if you have a society where there's nothing even remotely like a consensus about that.
But you know, this fugitive slave, I don't want to push you, Andrew, on this about the symbolic significance of it. But look, one of the things that keeps coming up is that escaped slaves who have been living in Pennsylvania for years, they're married, they have children born here, the slave catchers come, they nab them, and they're sent back.
Right.
The question is, what do you do with the kids?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So if you have a concept of a free womb, that is, people who are born in a free state, are they freeborn? And what do you do with their parents? Do you send the parents back and keep the kid? Or do you say you are incredibly generous and you just keep the kid with the parents and send everybody back? I mean, so that is when it's at situations like that I begin to think of Mr. Sessions. Mm-hmm. Because they're dividing families. Mm-hmm. And the Fugitive Slave Law in its application on a number of occasions did precisely that, divide families. And the question is, you have people who are opposed to the return of these fugitive slaves going to court to try and stop the process happening because it divides the family. But the law says, no, these people have to be returned.
Yep.
So I'm not usually in the business of promoting other people's books, but
you're going to do mine now?
Well, that goes without saying.
Okay.
That goes without saying. This is an extraordinary book, which gives you really the texture and the human dimension that you were just starting to talk about. And I didn't mean to negate any of that by using the word symbolic. And I would also like to make a distinction between pre-1850 and post-1850. Now, the book I was going to promote by just asking you, how many of you have read a book by someone named Sonia Nazario called Enrique's Journey? A few people? It's about a boy from Honduras who tries 6, 7, 8 times to get to the United States to be reunited with his mother, who has fled to the United States years earlier. And the reason I bring it up is because it's a book which suddenly puts a human face on this abstraction of the undocumented immigrant. Suddenly we see a real boy being beaten and robbed and worse, and we see his mother desperate to be reunited with her child. That, I think, is what the Fugitive Slave Law did in 1850, quite the opposite of what those who supported it expected it to do. What it did was it suddenly made slavery real in the free states. Because suddenly you had a person who had the courage to flee from the life of servitude running down the street, literally in Boston or in Syracuse or in New York or Philadelphia, with federally authorized authorities chasing him or her and citizens being required to join the posse. So you could no longer pretend that slavery was something that was in the South and had nothing to do with you. And that's, to me, the great paradox of that law. It had exactly the opposite effect of what it was intended to do. It animated the anti-slavery movement even more than it had been in the 1830s and 1840s.
I would say it radicalized it.
Radicalized.
Okay, but the point is, this is why I didn't become a lawyer, you know. For all you students out there, don't do it. That the law, in effect, says if you are asked, if you are requested by an official to help in the capture, then you are obligated to do it.
Right.
So you have, so to some extent, you have liberty not to interfere with this thing happening until the point at which somebody says you need to help.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then it completely changes your relationship to the law, the state, and the federal government. You become, in effect, a slave catcher.
Right. Now, Judy, I assume you agree that the law, the 1850 law in particular, radicalizes a whole section of the country in some ways, or at least that abolitionist movement in the North. But are there lessons to be learned from how the abolitionists mobilized their forces and held together and used the human drama of the fugitive stories to make political progress?
Oh yeah, sure. I think I think they had had decades of experience locally, organizing, finding lawyers who would defend these fugitives. They had money, they had communication networks, they had all of that stuff in place by the time the Fugitive Slave Law came into effect. So again, like these systems of churches and other organizations that are working, and lawyers who are defending these refugees coming in. There was a whole sort of foundation built before before things got to the sort of point at where they are now. So this stuff is not just sort of emerging out of nowhere.
They became
I just wanted to add something else to our equation here too, is about the separation of families and that, which is I'm glad you and I agree with everything you all said about what the 1850 law does. And I was also wanted us to remember too that that in the Mid-Atlantic, all of those states, when they their emancipation orders were gradual emancipation orders. So there were all sorts of that meant those are these free womb laws, right? That a child is born to be free, right? When that child reaches the age of 25 or whatever, that child would be free. But in the process, there's sort of all of this way in which this creates this fraught relationship with the child and the parents who are still enslaved, the child, right, who is born to be free, and it creates all sorts of gradations of slavery and freedom all along the border here in New York and Pennsylvania, New Jersey. All of those places had this kind of long extended kind of emancipation. Which made those communities particularly vulnerable, right? If your parents are enslaved and you are free, right? The child becomes more vulnerable to becoming kidnapped, and those are the same things I guess we're finding too with these children who've been separated from their parents. There are now particularly vulnerable populations of children who are being raised in sort of the U.S. system. They're much more likely, some of the stories that came out this summer, they're worried about these children becoming much more susceptible to being trafficked. I know the Trump administration is talking about these children being smuggled into the country, but most of these kids are coming, of course, as refugees, many of them with their parents. Once they're separated, they become much more vulnerable to those kinds of trafficking and kidnapping, which was the same sort of experience that that places like Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey discovered with these gradual emancipation acts. So there's lots of different lessons, not just from the Fugitive Slave Law, but from other experiences of slavery and freedom that we should be thinking about as we think about how to respond to the situation that we're in now.
I'm going to turn to the audience in a few minutes for questions, but since Judy brought that up, Andy, in that way, is there something else from your forthcoming book that you think we haven't covered yet that offers an interesting parallel or insider perspective on the current immigration crisis?
Well, I don't don't like sound bites so much. I don't mean it as such, but I think one could say, in fact, I did say, that the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 helped to create the first Black Lives Matter movement. It coalesced a movement among engaged African Americans in the free states to take the matters into their own hands when the law was so abusive to people with whom they identified. So they broke fugitives out of prison. In Boston, in a famous case, the Shadrach Minkins case, they tried it again in the Thomas Sims case and the Anthony Burns case and failed. But it gave a new energy and identity to the first, I think, arguably the first organized Black social resistance movement in American history. Beyond that, it also created an interracial resistance movement, so that you had blacks and whites working together in this cause in a way that had not been previously obvious. And Richard says it radicalized the abolitionist movement. It also pulled people who had been reluctant, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, who didn't like slavery and made some somewhat namby-pamby speeches about it in the 1840s, but after 1850 he said, no, this can't be happening in Massachusetts, and threw his personal prestige behind the movement. So it created a new movement, which, and he was a pretty good authority on this subject, Frederick Douglass was well aware of, and said, the Fugitive Slave Law is the greatest gift to the anti-slavery movement that we have yet received.
But Frederick also, old Douglas also said, the best way to stop slave catching is to kill a slave catcher.
Well, that's right.
He said,
Now, I know you're not trying to draw lessons
No,
from
well.
modern day. Right, but do you want to draw any other lessons from the crisis of the 1850s? I mean, from your work, from the stories that you wrote about in Captive's Quest, do you see any perspective that we haven't covered yet in some of these other questions?
Yeah, the lesson, if I take a stab, is that if you convince yourself that you are not complicit in crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated in the society to which you belong, you're letting yourself off the hook too easily. New Englanders were complicit in slavery up to their eyeballs before 1850. The textile industry depended on slave-grown cotton. Everybody was walking around wearing clothes made by cotton grown by slaves. But it was only after 1850 that suddenly they began to realize, as Amos Lawrence, one of the big industrialists in Boston, said before the Anthony Burns episode in Boston, we went to bed one night, good compromise unionists. We woke up the next morning as stark mad abolitionists because the slave problem had come to Boston. But somewhere in him, I would like to think, he must have realized his hands were not clean before then either. So all of us, we all bear responsibility for what the immigration policy of the United States is, whether we live anywhere near the Mexican border or not. And as citizens, we have to figure out how to act, whom to vote for, whom to support, what to do to try to arrive at a more rational, humane immigration policy in this country, which year after year the Congress of the United States has failed to do. That's all of our problem. It's not just somebody else's problem.
All right, well, let me ask it this way then, because obviously at this moment, when we look back, we celebrate the conversion to stark, raving, mad abolitionism, the fight against slavery, the rejection of complicity. But somebody that we also celebrate, Abraham Lincoln, is probably not an example of that. Most people wouldn't see him that way. He said, I hate to see the poor creatures hunted down, but I bite my lip and keep quiet because it's part of the law and order.
Yeah. Well,
how do you
this
characterize somebody like him?
This is the contradiction that was built into the United States from day one. You couldn't be a unionist and a radical abolitionist simultaneously. The two positions didn't go together. And the event that solved that problem was the Civil War. Civil War destroyed slavery, and then that contradiction was gone. Lincoln lived with that contradiction his whole political career, and he moved toward a more and more radical anti-slavery position, largely driven by the imperatives of the war itself.
Richard, do you see that in the same way? Do you see Lincoln moving after the war, not before the war, toward a more radical position?
There's still, I think the,
Because I think he embodies a certain law and order moderate that
Yes.
some people today, would be frustrated with. I wonder if you feel that
yes,
frustration
because
with someone like him.
at the heart of Lincoln's policy for much of his time in office is the notion that the best way to deal with emancipation is to also involve separation of the races. It is there all the time. He struggles against it at times, but by and large, that is his preferred solution. And it doesn't always work. And he's an astute political animal because he looks at the situation and says, look, this isn't working. The war isn't going the way it should be going. The British are making interesting noises about coming in on the side of the Confederacy. We need to come up with a solution. But at his heart, he is a person who believes that with emancipation should come separation of the races. At his heart, I suppose the best way we can put it is that he's a soft colonizationist.
Right. All right, so Judy, here's the point I was trying to see if Andy and Richard would embrace, which is, I don't think the anti-slavery movement would have succeeded without a leader like Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And so you could accuse him of being complicit, you could accuse him of being a soft colonizationist, right, of wanting a separation of the races, but you could also perhaps see that he was a pragmatist who understood how to win elections, not just, raise a protest, and that if you just had protesters, you wouldn't have victory.
Right, and I take him at his word, where that for him, Dred Scott was a moment for him where he could see sort of his notion of the way that the sort of Constitution works, and he saw Dred Scott as this sort of moment, I guess, and this is maybe you're the Lincoln scholar, so you'll tell me if I'm wrong.
But be careful, you're
Right.
a Dickinson, You're in Dickinson College. So
Right, I know, I just read into all
We
sorts
should
of-
note that the Dred Scott decision was authored by
All
class of
sorts of-
1795 graduate Roger Brookton.
Right. But and of course Buchanan was.
And he's another one.
We also
He's another-
claim,
he's another
we
bad
also
boy.
claim James
Another
Buchanan,
Dickinson
class
bad
of
boy,
1809.
yeah.
Actually, let's have a shout out for Moncure Conway. Right?
Could not everybody, even in Dickinson's audience, would know who Moncure Conway is.
He was a student here from Virginia who left the South and became an
Yeah,
abolitionist.
well, there you go.
A Southern-born abolitionist, a leader in the 19th century, and a graduate of Dickinson.
And then he goes to England and associates with some very strange people,
Well,
like
But I
Thomas
mean,
Carlyle.
but
right?
Lincoln says
nobody's
that this was
consistent. Nobody's consistent.
But my man from Dickinson College, I thought he was going to ask me it, is a man named...
Richard McAllister. We should talk about him briefly. And then, Judy, we'll come back to
No,
your
it's
point. But can you explain who Richard McAllister is? Because in a discussion of the Fugitive Slave Law, he's the Dickinsonian who's most complicit in this crisis.
Yes, he was a commissioner.
Even more than Tawney or Buchanan.
Yes, he was a commissioner from Harrisburg and Dauphin County. And he...
By the way, we pronounce it Dauphin here.
Okay, that's all right. Dauphin County, okay. Is that like Cairo, Illinois?
Yeah, exactly,
Okay.
exactly like that. Yeah.
But McAllister...
You make Dauphin sound too elegant when you pronounce it Dauphin. Yeah.
But McAllister was a commissioner who is the person that adjudicated cases for fugitive slave cases. And between September 1850 and the end of 1852, McAllister had a whole basket load of fugitive slave cases, and he sent back every one. Nobody had a chance of escaping McAllister's clutches. Once a fugitive slave came before him, he sent them back. But as a consequence, he was so enthusiastic about enforcing the law that he alienated the Harrisburg community. So that by 1853, he was gone. I mean, literally gone. Not just out of office, but out of the city and out of the state. He ended up in Kansas. That sounds like an exile, but I'm not going to say anything. But old Richard, even his vestry rejected him. You know what you have to do to get your vestry? Any Episcopalians in here? To get your vestry to reject you? That is a terrible slight. But McAllister was a proud man in that he said he was the only commissioner who had 100% record in the rendition of fugitive slaves.
And would you agree with this? He thought of himself as a law and order moderate.
Yes.
He didn't think of himself as a pro-slavery, anti-black figure. He may have been those things, but he thought of himself as a law and order moderate.
Listen, he comes from the last slaveholding family in Pennsylvania.
Right.
He read law in Georgia.
Right.
So I could put 2 and 2 together and get 5.
Right.
And say about old Richard,
But Judy, there's moderates like McAllister, and then there's moderates like Lincoln. You know, and so I go back to that question. You started to talk about Buchanan and Tawney, and that Dred Scott moment and how it radicalized some of the moderates in the anti-slavery wing. But you can't have a successful anti-slavery movement without those moderates. And so is there a lesson in there for the modern day, the resistance efforts to try to organize at the state and local level to stop policies that they don't like from the Trump administration?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess we can keep hoping it's going to be at the federal level too. I mean, I think Congress needs to make, a sane immigration policy. I mean, I guess that's where the moderates would come from. I don't know. I mean, what I was going to say was, for he talked about that moment being the moment that sort of brought him out of political retirement, right? That he realized that this was a critical moment and he needed to be in public office, right? Isn't that what Lincoln says about Dred Scott?
That's after the Kansas and Nebraska Act, before Dred Scott.
Oh, before Dred Scott.
Right.
Okay.
This question, I mean, this was the debate within the Republican Party in the 1850s. You had a radical wing and you had a moderate wing to which Lincoln more or less belonged. And it's the debate right now that's going on within the Democratic Party.
Right.
Whether the Democratic Party should move strongly to the left on hot-button issues like universal health care and so on, or whether that would be ennobling but ineffective politics.
Right.
Because it would lose the center. And I don't know the answer to that. We're going to find that out in the next few years.
Yeah.
But the one thing I want to say about Lincoln before we leave Lincoln, people, the word moderate often gets attached to him. And he was moderate by comparison to, say, Charles Sumner, and Frederick Douglass was extremely frustrated and angry with him, although I think they came to a real mutual understanding in later years. But my question, if he was so moderate, how come when he was elected, 7 slave states said, we're out of here?
Because of his party.
Yeah, but I mean, the way I talk to my students about it is the Southerners read him right. When he said, I'm placing slavery in the path of ultimate extinction, it might not have been fast enough for those of us who think slavery should have been extirpated immediately, but they took him at his word in that regard. And that seems to me, that tells you something about what he was about.
But the irony of it all, and well, these histories are full of ironies, right? The irony of it all is if the slaveholders had stayed put,
Right.
they would not have lost their slaves.
Correct.
So they go to war, and as a result of going to war, they lose their slaves.
Right.
So that you said that was dumb policy.
Well, from the point of view of their self-interest, it was very dumb.
Yeah, the slaves were encouraged.
All right, let's open this up to the audience. There will be representatives of the Clarke Forum taking around microphones. Just raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and make sure you wait until the microphone gets to you before you start speaking. Let's try to get some students to ask some of the first questions, if anybody wants to.
Okay, there's the right.
We will now take the first question.
Thank you. All right, this question's for all 3 of you. I know in the beginning of the talk, one of the things that we mentioned was that a lot of the signers of the Constitution didn't agree with slavery but put it in anyway. So to the 3 of you, do you believe that the institution of slavery in the Constitution was necessary for the signing that protected the liberties of all men?
Yes.
That is an argument that has no constitutional foundation. That is a political argument.
Hold on, explain what you mean by that.
Well, look, if you look at Prigg, if you look at all the decisions, they argue on a spurious constitutional argument or political argument and a historical argument that without that sort of understanding, there would have been no union. It is there in Prague, it's there in other, it's there in...
Andy just said it and Judy just said it.
Yeah, but
You disagree?
No. The problem with that is that in 1850, particularly in the congressional debates, there are those people who are arguing that there's no authority in the Constitution for recapturing fugitive slaves.
Right, but I think the question was, could there have been
A constitution.
a constitution without this accommodation?
Is that
of
what your
slave
question
owners?
was?
And
Yeah.
you know, on some,
Would the Constitution have been,
right.
Would the Constitution have been passed if they
No.
did not include slavery?
No.
And Judy is saying emphatically no, and I'm inclined to agree, but I'm also, you know, it's a little bit of one of those counterfactual questions. I mean, we can't really answer it authoritatively because they didn't try that experiment. So there's a late historian from University of Pennsylvania who puts it nicely in one of his books that we don't know if the South would have walked out of the convention if they hadn't put that fugitive slave clause in, but we do know that the Northerners were not willing to call their bluff. And that sort of captures it for me. There was a sense that without this accommodation, the whole thing would have collapsed. Whether it would have or not, and they would have come back after a couple of weeks and worked something else out, who knows? But it seems unlikely.
And we have to remember too that that there weren't just Southern representatives there speaking on behalf of slavery. Right, there was lots of money to be made in the slave trade in New York
Right.
and Rhode Island. You know, I mean, it was a national institution at the time.
Right.
So that makes it even harder to believe, you know, a different outcome was possible.
Hi, my name is Shay. This is for Professor Giesberg. Could you talk more about your digital project?
Sure. Thank you for asking.
Well, she might be a student from Villanova, I'm not sure.
I'll pay you later the $20 I told you. We're working on a project at Villanova now for 2 years. We're in our third year where we find ads taken out by former slaves in black newspapers primarily, where they're advertising for their family members from whom they were separated during slavery. And we have about 3,500 of those ads. The vast majority of those ads, people who are taking out these ads looking for their family members, are children who were separated from their parents in slavery, in the domestic slave trade, who are now, the moment they get out of slavery, the first thing they do is they're looking for their parents.
Judy, this is after the Civil War.
This is after the Civil War.
These
This
are
actually starts
post-war.
starts during the Civil War. These ads, some of our ads, we actually have some ads taken out before the Civil War, but the vast majority of them are 1865 forward. And we have ads up until the first decade of the 20th century.
Right.
So ads taken out by people looking for loved ones that they had been separated from for 50 years, even more.
Does this raise, Judy, the question of reparations?
Right.
Huh?
You could certainly use this database to make the argument, right? That it affects these families for generations. They never give up.
And it is a remarkable project.
So you should check it out. Go on it if you want to get involved with it. Let us know. You could talk to Moira. Where is she?
What's
She's
the
here.
title
She's
again?
a student working on it right now. It's informationwanted.org. So you can log on and check it out. There are 3,500 so far and counting ads taken out by people looking for people that family members who they're trying to find.
On this vein, just very briefly to take a stab at a parallel, since we're,
Sure.
you know, I think something seemed to turn a little bit in our politics when this child separation policy came into view. And a lot of people who hadn't been paying attention to the immigration problem suddenly woke up and were horrified by that prospect, that families were being torn apart. Well, I asked about another book, famous book that came out, provoked by the Fugitive Slave Law, was Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? very weak book in many ways, filled with stereotypes of African Americans. But one thing she did very well was to convey the way in which slavery destroyed families. And by doing that, and the numbers of people who read that book were staggering, by doing that, suddenly that abstraction called slavery became the concrete destruction of families, tearing children from their parents. And I think that you can't measure how that changes a society or the politics in a society, but I think it did change something fundamentally.
And do you think we are missing that element in today's culture, that it's not as powerful or not as...
But people don't, the assumption there is that if we tell the story, people would listen to it and understand it. And that's not the case, because before Uncle Tom's Cabin, in spite of all the great things that book achieved, there were people who were selling their slave narratives to communities all over this country, all over the North, as well as in Europe. And it did not, so that people were aware of these separations and divisions, but it didn't spark the kind of reaction until Uncle Tom's Cabin comes along. But Uncle Tom's Cabin, I would argue, could not have been possible without those slave narratives.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, so with the American Revolutionary War and with the Civil War, there were clear ends. For the Revolution, it was the fulfillment of the promises of the Declaration. For the Civil War, it was the promises of the Constitution, because these slaves were citizens. So with the illegal alien crisis, what is the end? It doesn't seem that there's a clear end, only means, which could be resisting Trump or just making them safe, giving them amnesty. It doesn't seem like there's a real idealistic end to this that could be intellectualized or really thought about. What do you think that would be? And do people have one?
Well, I mean, I guess you'd have to address all of the push factors, right? That all of the, you'd have to, the sort of massive sort of economic and political and social unrest that is, that are the after effects of colonialism and American economic policy in Central America and South America. There's all sorts of ways in which all of those things have been around for decades, and those to sort of like the end would be to sort of solve all of that, which I don't know, I don't know even where to start. But I think we start with sort of understanding that what are those push factors, and how has America been part of that history as well?
But America also prides itself on being the land of immigrants. But they have always opposed the arrival of immigrants.
Right.
I mean, that's another one of those weird things. Right. So if you read the stuff in the 1850s, people are, these bloody Irish are coming. And, but yet we sit back and we call ourselves the land of immigrants. But when immigration waves start, as they always do, they are met with deep and passionate resistance. So I don't know how you solve that problem.
I think we should also say, on this day of all days, Constitution Day, the end game is always the same, a more perfect union, right? You think of the Revolution and the Civil War as being so clear-cut, but at the time, they weren't always so clear-cut to the people who lived through them. So the end state that you imagine as being fixed, was more cluttered for the people who lived through it.
But they made great promises and hopes at the end of those two major events. The Revolutionary War, there was hope that this was going to be a new experiment. And at the end of the Civil War, it was a rebirth of America. The end of the Civil Rights Movement is we are on the path towards equality, and then the reaction sets in. And it always sets in. And that has been one of the stories in the wide sweep of American history, that these promises that we try to approximate always get stymied by a reaction. And the reaction is always to pull back from the promise, not to expand it, but to pull back from it. We're in a period of it again. All these kind of restrictions on voting rights and all the other things, immigration, that is where we're going. And we're going to have a new reawakening to challenge those things. And I don't know where that comes. I don't think it's going to come in the election.
Well, you sound like you're calling for a new constitution.
Oh dear.
Yeah, oh dear is right. Yeah.
Oh no. I will migrate then.
Yeah.
Hi. So at different points in time, people use different methods to try and create change that they want to create. And I'm wondering what methods the abolitionists used in the past that you think would be helpful now to try and push back against immoral policies such as the separation of families, separate from things like voter registration and things that we clearly need. So.
There's pushback. I think there is a lot of effort being made now. Some people, in terms of those who participate in the electoral process, now are now arguing that the only way to change this is that you have to go and make personal contacts with people and then get them to the polls to vote. I mean, for a democracy, this country has the most horrendous turnout figures. And think about it. 50, 60 years ago, people died for this right. And then the beneficiary of that right, the achievement of that right, do not flock to the polls in ways, or at least some people think that they flock to the polls and then they start to deny them the right to vote. So the struggle remains and people have to keep organizing in doing it. And that is, the abolitionists to some extent did that. Although for many of them, they thought that this was a fundamentally flawed society and therefore they shouldn't even participate in the politics of it. Others thought otherwise.
Right.
But I would argue that fugitive slaves forced them to come up with more radical approaches to dealing with the problem by confronting the system openly, defying the system. There's that wonderful quote about the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. This law does not respect me, I do not respect it. And that was a declaration, amazing declaration.
It's called civil disobedience, right?
Huh?
All right, that and, an organization and really political savvy. For every abolitionist who rejected the political status quo, there were two that were, who were willing to sort of work within the system to make changes as well. So, it seems like all of those things, right, that you can think of, we can think of examples in the abolitionist movement.
I'm a little simple-minded on this topic. It seems to me, if you look at our politics right now, there's something very odd. The political party in power, the court that seems to be evolving in a certain direction, do not represent the majority public opinion. And the reason we got ourselves in this situation is, as Richard was is not enough people vote. The reason the election came out the way it did last time was not because so many people voted for one candidate, but because not enough people came out to vote for the other candidate. That seems to me the key question, and if we can get that participation number up, things will take a turn for the better.
We probably have time for two more questions.
So, hi, Eric Vasquez, American Studies. There's plenty of cause for thinking about, in my own research in Central America, for thinking about, the prevalence of Central Americans in the so-called illegal immigrant crisis, which is to say histories of U.S. intervention through counterinsurgency policies that help produce genocide, torture, and all sorts of horrific human toll, and militarized societies even after that fact. So, but I'd like to press on this parallel a little bit more because I've heard a lot about the 19th century. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the present. One of the things that I think marks, let's say, the crisis right now is the way that undocumented people are increasingly racialized by the administration, how MS-13 comes to serve as a stand-in for people who are refugees from MS-13 or cartels or militarized governments who want to crack down on unions or kill women, 12 a day in femicides, et cetera. So I'm curious to what degree the Fugitive Slave Law sparked also increased racialization, or is that a parallel that could be made? Is there a way that the Fugitive Slave Law, like the kind of radicalization of ICE, like the kind of massive expansion of the Customs and Border Patrol, is there a parallel in the increased racialization of undocumented people found also in the history of the Fugitive Slave Law?
I would say that all anti-immigration is racialized. You should see some of the things that were said about the Irish in the 1850s.
Right.
So there's no wave of immigrants that come here that are not seen as fundamentally different and not belonging. And the descriptions of the Irish sound very, very familiar to anybody who has done anything on Black history. And the other things about ICE, I am struck by the enforcement mechanism that was employed in the Fugitive Slave Law. It is supposedly all-encompassing, and it is draconian. It is not as organized, say, as ICE, with people turning up, but they did turn up on your doorstep. If you take the case of the Pembroke brothers, their brother had escaped much earlier in Pennington. James Pennington is the brother, the old famous reverend. These guys escape 20-odd years after their older brother. And they are tracked down in the middle of the night to a hideaway in New York City. You know what it is for police to go into a Black community in the middle of the night in New York City in the 1854 to pick up somebody? That is organization. They knew where they were. And as a consequence, then the law is enforced, and these people are sent back. So there's the state mechanism is a frightening tool if you're on the other side. Yeah?
I guess to your point about racialization too, I was thinking about when Andrew was talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, because notably when you read the book, all of the Black characters in there are really white, right? All of the people who you're supposed to sympathize with, she describes as having, sort of light skin, blue eyes, and they're all slaves, right? So there's so the popularity of that book can be explained in a lot of ways, but also because all of the Black characters, all the ones you're supposed to sympathize with, she very carefully made them seem like they could be somebody right, and somebody that you would sympathize with. She didn't expect her readers to be able to sympathize with somebody who didn't look white. So when you read that book, and when I use it in my class, my students always point that out right away. Why are all the Black characters in here so white? Because that's what that she knew her audience. She's appealing to women, children, because of their sort of maternal instincts and all of that, and they read it and they passed it to their husbands. But she made all the characters in there white.
And one thing that you discover when you study this period is that some of the most eloquent of the fugitives really go after this racialization issue. So William Wells Brown, for example, gives this wonderful, ironic, actually hysterically funny speech in which he talks about all his distinguished relatives back in Kentucky. One of them is the ambassador to Great Britain, and one of them just left for The Hague or something. Because, of course, he's well aware that this conception that there are actually, there are people who are Black and there are people who are white, and there isn't this great amalgamation going on, particularly in the South, because of the forced servitude of Black women to service the pleasures of white men, that this whole idea of racial identity was fundamentally incoherent.
If we could add, if one of the great contributions of the Founding Fathers is that they started this miscegenation movement early on. And while the abolitionists were always accused of this interracial business and promoting interracial sex, the ones who were really doing it, I hasten to add, and every one of these race mixed people that old Harriet Beecher Stowe talks about also carry with it. And I think if you look at the slave ads, and the number of people who are described as nearly white, they are in effect subverting their own system because the system cannot recognize these people. If somebody is nearly white, how the hell do you pick them up? So you have created a fifth column within your own society because of your inability to control your urges. And I think I'm on television, so I should stop at that point.
All right, we're running out of time, but one last quick question, and we'll have compact answers.
There's one down here.
From the very first words written that started our entire experiment, We the People, was based on a number of founding principles and values upon which we built the nation, addressed the Constitution. We've addressed slavery and the problems that you had with abolition and the Civil War and so on, in the search of a compromise. And the magic of how we did get to a Constitution is that leaders from different points of view learned to compromise. But why are we in such a mess today? Because we're not looking for compromise anymore, because we're too busy compromising our values. And that we just can't seem to find a way by which all of us can sit around the table and just commit to our founding values and come up with a compromise that incorporates all of our values. And you won't come up to a satisfactory solution until I think you do that. And if we have your comments on that, please.
I think you're correct. The problem is that those great principles that you are trying to address are occurring in a context of slavery. And that is where the problem arises. So the Compromise of 1850, as it was labeled, although some people have argued, I think erroneously, that it postponed the Civil War for 10 years because it was a real political compromise. It did not, because what it did was it compromised the principle of freedom. And after all, that is what made America different. This is what abolitionists, particularly Black American abolitionists, used to ask their own people, their own American citizens. It says, look, if the monarchy of England could abolish slavery, why can't the Republicans do it? And it's an answer that no Republican could answer. They could not give a satisfactory answer. And it drove them nuts because of all those folks having spent time in England and then come back to America. He says, you know, when I was in England, I went on a monarchical train and I wasn't discriminated against. I went to a monarchical church and I wasn't discriminated against. And he goes on and says, well, what are the Republicans doing? And the Republicans cannot answer the question because of this thing called slavery.
My quick response would be slavery was an issue that could not be compromised. Ultimately there was no middle position. You could defer it and you could postpone it, which they tried to do repeatedly, including in 1850. But at the end of the day, you either were for it or you were against it.
Lincoln?
Today, we have tough issues, and we could list them. Health care, economic inequality, climate change, continuing disparities in how justice is meted out to white people and Black people. But none of those issues rises to the level of the uncompromisable issue of slavery. So I would like to think that actually we will get a little closer to what you're talking about, because the public appetite for compromise is there. The political system is not providing it at the moment. And I want to be optimistic that that will change.
Judy, can you add one more comment and bring us home?
I can.
And stay optimistic.
I'm trying to. I was really reaching for something
Richard's making me
optimistic.
depressed sometimes with his comments.
Yeah. I guess I would just go back to something I was reading this weekend in the New York Times, which is that Americans tend to be better than our laws. and they tend to be better than our leaders. So I'm going to just hold on to that and hope that, that eventually we're at the point where our laws and our leaders are as good as the people.
All right, well, that's a tough form of optimism, but I'll take it. Look, I think on Constitution Day especially, it's important that you have thought-provoking conversations, and I really think you've delivered a very thought-provoking panel to us. This is part of a year-long effort by the House Divided Project to address Dickinson's connections to slavery. The Clarke Forum helped enable us. We're going to be sharing research from students over the course of the year about the college's relationship to the institution of slavery and its destruction in the 19th century. I thought you kicked it off extremely well, and I want to thank all of you for coming. In a minute, we'll thank them together, but first I just want to remind you that we're going to have a book signing in the lobby afterwards. If anybody would like to talk to the speakers, you can do it out in the lobby. So let's thank them, though, for coming to Dickinson. Thank you so much. Jackson. You're a firebrand. Thank you. That was